We are told that Venezuela's economic collapse is the result of American sanctions and imperialism. We are told that Hugo Chávez's socialist revolution was destroyed by capitalist sabotage and foreign interference. We learn that Venezuela is a victim of external aggression rather than internal policy failures. But this is the sanitized version of history, written by those who want to admit the truth about resource dependency. If you want to understand how the world's most oil-rich nation became one of its poorest, how hyperinflation can destroy a modern economy in less than a decade, and how natural resource wealth can become a civilizational curse, you have to look past the political rhetoric. You have to look at the economics of oil dependency. Venezuela wasn't destroyed by American imperialism. It was destroyed by its own addiction to petroleum profits. This is the story of the resource curse in action, and how black gold became a poison that killed an entire economy. The petroleum promise. To understand Venezuela's catastrophe, we must first understand the moment when the country thought it had won the economic lottery. In 1976, President Carlos Andrés Pérez stood before a cheering crowd in Caracas to announce the nationalization of Venezuela's oil industry. After decades of foreign companies extracting Venezuelan crude for their own benefit, the black gold would finally belong to the Venezuelan people. The timing seemed perfect. Oil prices had quadrupled following the 1973 Arab oil embargo, and Venezuela possessed some of the largest proven oil reserves in the world. The newly created state oil company, PD, would generate revenues that could transform Venezuela from a developing nation into a modern society. Pérez promised that oil wealth would fund education, healthcare, infrastructure, and industrial development. Venezuela would use its petroleum revenues to build a diversified economy that could compete globally. The country would become the Norway of Latin America. The initial results seemed to validate this optimistic vision. Oil revenues flooded government coffers, providing resources for development projects. Caracas experienced a boom as highways, office buildings, and shopping centers transformed the city. Venezuelan consumers enjoyed subsidized gasoline cheaper than bottled water. But beneath the surface, a sinister economic dynamic was taking hold. The massive inflow of oil dollars was beginning to distort Venezuela's economic structure in ways that would prove catastrophic. The phenomenon is known to economists as Dutch disease, named after the Netherlands' experience with natural gas discoveries in the 1960s. When a country experiences a sudden influx of foreign currency from resource exports, the exchange rate strengthens and makes other sectors uncompetitive in international markets. Think about the mechanics of this process. Venezuelan oil sales generated billions of dollars that had to be converted into bolivars to pay domestic expenses. This massive demand for bolivars drove up the currency's value, making Venezuela manufactured goods and agricultural products expensive for foreign buyers, while making foreign imports cheap for Venezuelan consumers. Venezuelan farmers found that they could no longer compete with subsidized food imports from neighboring countries. Venezuelan manufacturers discovered that their products were undercut by foreign competitors who could sell in the Venezuela market at lower prices than domestic producers could match. The irrational response for Venezuelan businesses was to abandon productive activities and focus instead on importing and distributing foreign goods. Why invest in building factories when you could make higher profits by importing products? Why develop agricultural land when you could import food more cheaply? The import addiction. By the 1980s, Venezuela had become addicted to imports financed by oil revenues. The country that had once produced its own food, clothing, and consumer goods was increasingly dependent on foreign suppliers for basic necessities. This import dependency seemed sustainable as long as oil prices remained high, but it was creating dangerous vulnerabilities. The import addiction extended beyond consumer goods to include essential industrial inputs and even refined petroleum products. Despite having massive oil reserves, Venezuela lacked sufficient refining capacity to meet domestic demand for gasoline and diesel. The country was simultaneously the world's largest oil exporter and a net importer of refined products. But the most damaging aspect was its impact on human capital. Venezuelan students saw no reason to study engineering, agriculture, or manufacturing when the most lucrative careers were in oil industry management or import distribution. The country's best minds were drawn away from productive sectors toward rent-seeking activities. Venezuelan universities stopped producing the scientists, technicians, and entrepreneurs who could have diversified the economy. Instead, they produced lawyers and business administrators whose skills were suited for managing oil revenues, rather than creating wealth through production. The government reinforced these distortions through its spending priorities. Instead of investing oil revenues in education, research, and infrastructure that could support economic diversification, Venezuelan leaders used petroleum profits to fund consumption and patronage networks, subsidized food, fuel, and utilities made life comfortable for middle-class Venezuelans in the short term. But these policies prevented the economy from developing competitive advantages in non-oil sectors. Venezuelan businesses never faced competitive pressures that might have forced them to become efficient. The result was an economy that looked prosperous on the surface, but was actually becoming less capable of generating wealth through productive activities. Venezuela was consuming its oil wealth rather than using it to build sustainable sources of future income. The Chávez Revolution. The contradictions of oil-dependent development came to a head in the 1980s and 1990s as petroleum prices declined and Venezuela faced economic crises. The country that had seemed destined for prosperity found itself struggling with debt, inflation, and social unrest. In 1989, President Poorest attempted to implement economic reforms recommended by the International Monetary Fund, including the elimination of fuel subsidies. The measures triggered massive riots, known as the Caracazo, in which hundreds were killed. The riots demonstrated that Venezuelan society had become completely dependent on oil-funded subsidies and was unwilling to accept economic adjustments necessary for fiscal sustainability. Any politician who suggested reducing oil-funded benefits faced violent popular resistance. Into this crisis stepped Hugo Chávez, a former military officer who promised to use oil wealth more effectively for the Venezuelan people. Chávez's message was simple. Previous governments had allowed foreign companies and elites to steal Venezuela's oil wealth, but his Bolivarian revolution would ensure petroleum revenues serve the poor majority. When Chávez took power in 1999, oil prices were near historic lows at around $10 per barrel. But over the following decade, Chinese economic growth, Middle Eastern instability, and global financial speculation drove crude oil prices to unprecedented levels, reaching nearly $150 per barrel in 2008. The oil boom provided Chávez with resources that no previous Venezuelan leader had possessed. Government revenues increased by more than 400% in less than a decade, creating fiscal space for massive social programs that dramatically reduced poverty in the short term. Chávez used oil windfalls to fund healthcare clinics, subsidize food programs, free housing, construction, and educational initiatives that improved living standards for millions of Venezuelans. His approval ratings soared as poor communities experienced tangible benefits from petroleum wealth, but Chávez made the same fundamental error as his predecessors. He treated oil revenues as a permanent source of funding for consumption rather than a temporary resource that should be invested in building sustainable economic capacity. The spending spree. Chávez's approach to oil wealth management was even more destructive than previous Venezuelan governments, because he explicitly rejected the idea that the country needed to diversify its economy. He argued that Venezuela's massive oil reserves made economic diversification unnecessary. This ideological commitment to oil dependency led to policy decisions that accelerated the economy's structural distortions. Chávez imposed price controls that made domestic production unprofitable, while increasing import subsidies that made foreign goods artificially cheap. The government established a complex system of multiple exchange rates that gave preferred access to dollars for favored allies, while restricting foreign currency for private businesses. This system created enormous opportunities for corruption while discouraging productive investment. State-owned enterprises were expanded into sectors where they had no crowding out private companies that might have developed competitive advantages in international markets. The government's share of the economy grew dramatically, but state companies consistently operate at losses covered by oil revenues. Most destructively, Chávez used oil money to fund massive increases in government employment, without regard to productivity or economic necessity. Public sector jobs became a form of welfare that maintained political support but contributed nothing to productive capacity. The fiscal implications were staggering. Government spending increased by over 300% during the Chávez years. But virtually all of this increase was funded by oil revenues rather than taxes on productive activities. The government was essentially giving away oil wealth to maintain popularity without building sustainable sources of future income. By 2012, Venezuela was spending over 95% of its export earnings from oil, while producing almost nothing else that foreign buyers wanted to purchase. The country had become a pure petrostate, completely dependent on petroleum revenues for fiscal survival and import capacity. The price collapsed, the fundamental weakness of Venezuela. A oil-dependent model became apparent in 2014, when global oil prices began a dramatic decline that cut petroleum revenues by more than 75% in less than 2 years. The same market forces that had enriched Venezuela during boom years now threatened to bankrupt the country. The price collapse was driven by multiple factors, including increased U.S. shale oil production, slowing Chinese economic growth, and the removal of supply restrictions in Libya and Iraq. But for Venezuela, the specific causes mattered less than the devastating impact on government finances. A country that had become completely dependent on oil revenues suddenly faced massive fiscal deficits that could not be financed through borrowing or taxation. Venezuelan government debt was already at unsustainable levels, and the domestic economy was too weak to generate significant tax revenues. President Nicolás Maduro, who had succeeded Chávez after the latter's death in 2013, faced an impossible choice. He could either reduce government spending drastically, which would trigger social unrest, or he could maintain spending by printing money, which would generate inflation and currency devaluation. Maduro chose monetary expansion, reasoning that inflation was less politically dangerous than austerity. The Venezuelan central bank began printing bolivars at unprecedented pace to fund government operations that could no longer be sustained by oil revenues. The results were predictable and catastrophic. Inflation accelerated from manageable levels in 2014 to hyperinflationary rates exceeding 1,000,000% by 2080. The bolivar became worthless as a store of value, forcing Venezuelans to resort to barter transactions or foreign currencies. But hyperinflation was only the most visible symptom of more fundamental economic collapse. The combination of price controls, currency restrictions, and monetary chaos made normal business operations impossible. Domestic production fell by over 75% as companies could not obtain raw materials, maintain equipment, or price their products rationally. The humanitarian crisis. The economic collapse translated directly into a humanitarian crisis that affected every aspect of Venezuelan society. A country that had once been one of the wealthiest in Latin America suddenly could not provide basic necessities for its population. Food shortages became endemic as domestic agricultural production collapsed and the government lacked foreign currency to pay for imports. Venezuelans spent hours in lines hoping to purchase subsidized food, but the stores were frequently empty. The healthcare system disintegrated as hospitals ran out of medicines and equipment. Diseases that had been eliminated decades earlier, including measles and malaria, returned as public health infrastructure collapsed. The electricity grid began failing regularly, leaving entire cities without power for days or weeks. Water systems stopped functioning, forcing residents to collect rainwater or seek supplies from contaminated sources. The scale of human suffering was unprecedented for a peacetime economic collapse. Over 6 million Venezuelans, representing more than 20% of the population, left the country between 2015 and 2020. This mass exodus created the largest refugee crisis in the Western Hemisphere's modern history, but the most revealing aspect of the crisis was that it occurred in a country with the world's largest proven oil reserves. Venezuela's petroleum wealth didn't disappear. The country simply could no longer convert its oil into the goods and services its population needed for survival. The resource curse revealed. The Venezuelan catastrophe is the most dramatic example in modern history of how natural resource wealth can destroy rather than enrich a nation. The country's massive oil reserves, which should have been a source of prosperity, became the mechanism through which an entire economy was systematically dismantled. The resource curse operated through multiple channels that reinforced each other in a downward spiral. Oil revenues allowed Venezuela to avoid difficult economic reforms, while providing incentives for rent-seeking behavior that discouraged productive investment. More fundamentally, oil dependency created a political economy that made rational policy-making impossible. Politicians who suggested reducing oil-funded subsidies faced immediate punishment from voters who had become addicted to petroleum-financed benefits. The Venezuelan case demonstrates that natural resource wealth is only valuable if it can be converted into sustainable economic capacity. Countries that use resource revenues to fund consumption rather than investment ultimately end up poorer than they would have been without the resource discovery. Think about the counterfactual scenario. If Venezuela had never discovered oil, it might have developed competitive advantages in agriculture, manufacturing, or services that could have generated sustainable prosperity. Instead, oil wealth prevented the development of these alternative capabilities, while creating dependencies that proved catastrophic when petroleum prices declined. The modern parallel Venezuela's experience offers crucial lessons for understanding contemporary economic challenges in resource-rich countries. The same dynamics that destroyed Venezuela's economy are currently operating in Russia, Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, and other petroleum-dependent nations. The fundamental problem is that natural resource wealth creates an illusion of economic strength, while actually making countries more vulnerable to external shocks. Resource-rich countries often have lower long-term growth rates than nations because they fail to develop the human capital necessary for competitive development. The Venezuelan case also demonstrates the dangers of using monetary policy to postpone economic adjustments. When governments resort to money printing to finance spending that cannot be sustained by productive activity, the result is invariably hyperinflation and collapse. But perhaps the most important lesson is that natural resource wealth is a test of institutional quality rather than a guarantee of prosperity. Countries with strong institutions can use resource revenues to build sustainable capacity, while countries with weak institutions will be destroyed by the political pressures that resource wealth creates. The tragedy of Venezuela is that it possessed everything necessary for sustained prosperity except the institutional wisdom to manage its petroleum wealth responsibly. The country's massive oil reserves, educated population, and strategic location should have made it one of the wealthiest nations in Latin America. Venezuela's collapse wasn't caused by American sanctions, socialist ideology, or external sabotage. It was caused by the fundamental contradiction between oil dependency and economic development that has destroyed resource-rich countries throughout history. The lesson of Venezuela is that natural resources are only as valuable as a nation's ability to convert them into sustainable human welfare. When countries become addicted to resource revenues, they lose the capacity to generate wealth through productive activities, leaving them vulnerable to catastrophic collapse when resource prices decline. The Venezuelan people are paying the price for decades of economic policies that treated oil wealth as a permanent solution rather than a temporary resource that needed to be invested wisely. Their suffering serves as a warning about the dangers of the petroleum curse. I'm John, and this is the Cinematic History Tailies channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming. The next resource-dependent economy is already showing signs of strain, and understanding how oil wealth destroyed Venezuela will help you recognize the patterns before they become obvious to everyone else.